Well, we don't appear to be muted, which is always a good start. Hello, I am John, and this is...
Totally Tank, the tankiest podcast in Tankville. It's April 6, 2024, and this is episode 57. My name is Rob, and I'm joined by...
Yes, my name is John. Hello, welcome to the Tanktainment answer to Wayne's World. We just left that line in the script, and it seems to keep working to whatever extent things work for us. The tank today is the 90mm gun tank M48 or M48 Patton, the American Cold Warrior. Yes, and just a reminder that if you want an excellent Totally Tank t-shirt, guaranteed to start conversations with terrifying people, head over to redbubble.com and search for Totally Tanked.
All right, it's time to get into the tank, but which tank is it and why is it called a Patton? So the interwebs tells us the Patton tank may refer to any of a series of tanks used by the US military from the 1950s to the 1990s, named for General George S. Patton. From the M46 Patton medium tank model, operational during the Korean War, the M47 Patton, the first US MBT, in service from 1952 through till 1959, and then straight on to the M48 Patton in service from the 1950s and still being used today around the world. And some people include the M60, the standard US MBT from the 1960s, until it was replaced by the M1 Abrams in 1980. Foolish people who are wrong call the M60 a Patton. Yes, which still extensively used worldwide, but is not officially designated a member of the Patton family, even though there are a lot of interchangeable parts between the M48 and the M60.
Well, as we discussed when we did the Pershing, there is a continuity of design from the Pershing all the way through to the M60. And with a brief silhouette flashcard, I would be hard-pressed to correctly identify which of that family was which.
For today, we're just looking at the M48 and its variants, none of those other imposters.
We think the M48 on its own is going to give us more than enough to talk about for some time. And the halftime show is going to be half an hour of me talking about George Patton and why he might be the worst human being who ever lived. So we will get to that little treat later. Yeah. So I've just flashed up on the screen. We've got, for those on the live stream, Alexander Vlad, who wants to comment regarding the TR-85. We will park that for the second half, my friend. Jesse from Finland. 7 a.m. is a wonderful time to start drinking on a Saturday morning, so well done. We got Brandon Makes Stuff, Philippine Dreams. Video is good, audio is stuttering. Well, okay.
That might just be us. Hopefully it comes good. If anybody else is finding the audio stuttering, please leave a comment for us and we'll...
I don't know what we'll do.
We'll
just keep going.
Drink more beer and I'm sure it'll come good on the day.
Okay. All right, Rob, you've got some things you want to talk about.
Audio is a little weird. We've got another one from Brandon. Okay. Anyway, stats. The M48 Patton in service from 1952 through to present day, in use by the US Army from 1952 to 1987, and the Marines, the US Marines from 1954 to 1973. Designed by the Chrysler Defense Engineering Company in 1950 and built by a number of firms, including Chrysler, the Fisher Body Company, the Ford, and the American Locomotive Company. These are all fun stats from the interwebs. US cost of $300,000 at the time, which today is about $3 million in today's money. 12,000 or close enough for government work of all variants built. We had the variants produced started off with the M48. The M48A1 from 1952 to 1956, the M48A2 from 1955 to 1957, and then the M48A3 from 1957 to 1961. Weight, 45 tonnes, up to another 5 tonnes combat weight. Length, 9.3 metres or 30 feet, 6 inches. Width, 3.65 metres, 12 foot or 12 foot wide. Height 3.1 metres or 10 foot, 2 inches high.
It's a boxy beast.
Yeah. Crew of 4. The first time the US has gone to a crew of 4.
Finally, the hull machine gun is gone.
The hull machine gun is gone. So the commander, gunner, loader, and driver. Armour. It has nicely sloped front armour with 110 mils of armour at cast iron steel at 60 degrees. What was interesting with the cast hull, there's one big cast piece for the hull, which was good in some ways, but allowed them to have thicker parts of armour in the middle where you're more likely to get hit for things, and then thinner parts on the edges of the cast in order to save weight. But meant it was very much a case of keep the front towards enemy, otherwise you'll be showing, if you're angled, you don't want to be angling the front of the tank at the wrong angle in order to present the weaker points of your armour to the enemy. So,
I mean, it's not a lot of armour. I mean, that would be, a Cromwell had similar levels of armour, 100 odd millimetres. Admittedly, Cromwell not angled at all,
no.
But so sort of getting into this concept of enough armour to keep out small arms, but waiting for the invention of laminates and composites to really get serious about protection.
We're getting lots of comments about the noise, John. So we might, folks, take just a moment now to see if something can be done. All right. So.
All right, just bear with me 1 second.
Well, we'll keep on talking and see what happens and let us know. All right. The front of the turret was 178 millimetres of so much better. Great. The rear, top, and bottom of the hull around 35 mils, depending on where you're looking at. The main armament of the M48 was the 90 millimetre M41 gun, and then they changed to the 105. That was for the M48 through to the M48A3, and then with the M48A5, they changed to the 105mm M68 gun because they couldn't bring themselves to buy the L7 from the British. They just had to license it and do it themselves and not call it the L7 at all. Secondary armaments, they had a 30 cal coax in the turret, and then a 50 cal on a remote mount for the commander. Or then that was when that proved to be a little bit exposed for the commander. Even though it was remote, he had to climb out of the outside the tank to reload the 50 cal. So they decided they built him a brand new commander's cupola, which had the 50 cal placed inside of it, so he could reload and fire from the safety of the tank, which was pretty good. But it does give it a very distinctive look of turrets on turrets.
Yeah, I mean, the Americans just love turrets on turrets. And when you get into the M60, the commander's cupola was the size of a small tank on its own.
Yes.
It's the big thing to remember with the M48 is the context of the Cold War. And right up until Yom Kippur in 1973, the American Army wasn't even sure if it wanted to exist anymore because nuclear weapons were just meant to take care of all the US's military needs. And the the M48 was very much designed with a view to fighting as part of a nuclear war. So all the design limitations kind of baked into it, particularly its boxiness, and which gave it a great deal of volume on the interior, was because it was meant to fight in a post-nuclear exchange environment where it had to stay buttoned up for days at a time. And no one else in the world really took it as seriously as the Americans did. So they created a quite compromised design for conventional warfare, but it was pretty much the only one that was going to be effective in nuclear warfare. And the big thing that happened in 1973 was the Arab-Israeli War then showed that, in fact, there could be quite serious conventional war without the use of nuclear weapons. And the US Army said, oh, maybe that's something we might want to be involved in. And out of that came the M1 design finally.
Yeah. So the engine started off with a Continental V12 air-cooled petrol engine.
Gasoline. I mean, honestly, in 1950,
I know
they're still using petrol engines.
Yeah. I mean, it was enough of a fire hazard anyway with the hydraulics, but having petrol inside it as well is
something worth noting. Is that because we have lived our entire lives in an era where hydraulic fluid is non-flammable. But that's a recent-ish invention, and it used to be that hydraulic fluid was incredibly flammable, and so that was quite a technical achievement by whoever figured that out. So just something to bear in mind that was a problem that isn't a problem anymore.
All right, so it had 650 horsepower. So still, I mean, they were trying to get the most they hadn't figured out a diesel engine that could get it up to the speed that they wanted. So that's where they were stuck with that. Then they went with the M48 A2. They upped it to still the same V12 petrol engine, which got pushed them out to 690 horsepower, and eventually they got to the M48 A3. And this became the new standard for the A3s and the A5s. They got a Continental V12 air-cooled twin-turbo diesel engine with 750 horsepower. 2 forward gears, 1 reverse, so it was very easy to drive.
That's a weird old gearbox, isn't it?
Well,
it's one gear for getting start and 1 gear for rolling along.
There you go. Torsion bar suspension, fuel capacity. This is a fun one. All right. So the V12 petrol engine started out with 760 litres of petrol, which would get it 110 kilometres. Wow, that's not very far. So 70 miles is what you're looking at there.
I mean, for us here in Canberra, that's to Goulburn, which is not a long drive.
No, it's an hour's, yeah. But
it's basically 2 hours of operation at tank speeds.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Then when they
fast tank speeds.
Yeah, when they added 4 external fuel drums, it got it up to 1,600 litres of petrol and could take it out to 215 kilometres. Eventually, when they went to the turbo diesel, they could fit in 1,100 litres of petrol, and that would get them out to 500 kilometres. So that's a huge difference. And once you go to the diesel engine, it just gets you going so much further. Maximum speed of about 48 k's an hour, about 45 for the diesel. So I lost a bit of top speed, but it was still good enough for what they wanted. And don't worry, boys and girls, it does have a tank telephone, but it does not make an appearance in Girls and Panzer.
The telephone doesn't make an appearance?
No, the tank doesn't.
No M48 and Girls and Pets.
No.
It's too new, isn't it?
Yes, it is too new. Yeah. Even it's too new. So, but it does have a tank telephone on the right rear. All right. Design and development. There was a great.
There were some problems.
There were some problems, but the great quote from General Bruce Clark.
It's a great quote.
All right. What he said about it was, "We know exactly what we want. We want a fast, highly mobile, fully armoured, lightweight vehicle. It must be able to swim, cross any terrain, and climb 30-degree hills. It must be air transportable. It must have a simple but powerful engine requiring little or no maintenance. The operational range should be several hundred miles. We would also like it to be invisible."
You should have put in flying in there or something, shouldn't you?
Well, air transportable. This is a tank built by committee saying, "Oh, we want it to do this, this, and this." I mean,
yeah, it was the start of what would become a lot of problems with American military procurement. But the other issue that they really had with it was that they started production in 3 different factories before they'd finished trials, and the trials were feeding back changes that really needed to be made, and and that was then going out to 3 different factories without any actual control over the specs. So modelers can just do what you want. There's one of them out there somewhere with whichever way you build it.
Yeah. But I was really impressed was when they, talking about the construction, when the Chrysler Delaware tank plant was commissioned, construction of the factory began in July 1951. 11 months later, they started building tanks. 11 months. Can you imagine doing that? Putting together a huge factory these days and having tanks coming off the production line 11 months later, when you've just started, when you've just broken ground on the stupid thing.
And to some extent, a factory today is just a warehouse with some German robots in it. But with tanks, you need overhead cranes, and you need extremely high weight overhead cranes. That's. They must have had the designs well drawn up in advance.
It's still, I still saw that as an amazing piece of engineering, buddy. Yeah. And they were fully open by a month later in July '52. So not only had they started producing tanks 11 months after breaking ground, they were fully open and producing.
Lord Nuffield was not involved.
No.
Sorry, Viscount Nuffield.
Viscount, yes.
Got to show him due respect, the old Nazi. Yeah.
Supposed. No. All right. Fun things it had. Telescopic rangefinder, the stereoscopic rangefinder, which is the little eyes on the side of the turret. will basically provide you two pictures of what the commander was looking at, and then you would twiddle some dials, you would wiggle some widgets, and when the two images overlapped each other, that was what it would...
it would then give you a number
of how far away it was.
How far away it was. And this is a design that works really well in ships, where the rate of fire is maybe one round every 3 minutes.
And you can have a great deal of distance between the two, but when your distance of your two images is the width of your turret, it's not as accurate.
And also a naval rangefinder might have a baseline of 3 to 5 meters. And there is one person whose only job is to twiddle the dials and give the readings, whereas in this case, the poor old gunner is trying to...
That's the commander.
Oh, okay. Anyway, whoever's working the rangefinder is having to make the tanks coincide. God help you if there's two tanks already out there making them line up.
That was one of the things of is not everybody's eyes worked with the stereoscopic images.
Oh, and they get tired very fast.
Well, think of the people who can never see the magic image in the magic image paint photos or paintings.
Yeah,
right?
Magic eye.
Magic eye paintings. So they cannot, their eyes just cannot bring these things together. So again, you had to then cope and deal with those sort of things.
But also this comes down to the thing that I think it takes about a week to train someone to estimate the range of a tank, because tanks are roughly the same length and width,
yes.
Near enough for a range estimate for a high velocity round.
Unless it's French, in which case it's much smaller.
But basically you can be trained to estimate range to within 100 meters in the space of a week, at which point you don't need to be twiddling little dials and trying to coincide images. And in particular, if you're in a pre-prepared position, you might even have markers out on the...
Yes.
Yeah.
All those sort of fun things, but I mean, it was still a very useful. It was basically a furthering of technologies that hadn't been available to tanks prior to this.
Yeah, and
so
it was quickly abandoned in favour of laser rangefinders, which still have enormous problems. But yeah,
that leaf that's 100 metres away, that's between you and the target, right? That's 3 kilometres away. Yes.
Or we have ranged the fence or the building a kilometre behind the tank. Yeah.
We overshot.
It might actually.
I hope nobody was living there.
It probably, for all the technologists, much prefer to sell a technology solution. Training people to estimate range is probably actually always going to be the quickest and best way to go.
And g'day, Jamie from Adelaide. Good on you. Good. Thanks for joining us. Cast armour, as I was saying before, it can be thicker and thinner. It was the first US tank with a cast hull, I believe.
I mean, Australia, of course, pioneered the cast hull with the Sentinels.
But it was, or maybe it was the first. I forgot to write down exactly which ones they were. Then you had the Xeon Night Scope Light, the great big box sitting right above the gun. Again, another. So it's basically your infrared spotlight. So you could have it as a white light shining out in the dark and showing everybody where you were, or you could put the infrared filter over the top of it, and it would only be seen by anybody wearing infrared goggles.
Yeah, by any high-tech peer.
And
the Russians had infrared long before the Americans, so it wasn't like you had a secret weapon there. If you were radiating in infrared, the Russians were probably, some of them at least, were seeing you.
But the point being is only Russian tanks were doing that, whereas any sort of infantry did not have access to those sort of things. So that was if you're running around mopping up infantry, then you're pretty good. But
but I mean, fundamentally, the world of tanks has moved to a point where they say, you know what? A passive thermal imager is a much, much, much better...
Oh, yeah. But we're talking about 1950s technology here.
Yeah. No, I get you.
Yeah. All right.
But sorry, just to go back to that, that is why there's all these really weird fittings when you see an M48, as a gate guard or, parked in a neighbourhood, as we just love parking tanks in neighbourhoods. So it's got all these weird fittings on the top of the gun mantlet, and that's because it used to have all these weird boxy lights sticking on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Some of the user comments about the M48 that I found online was much quicker. It was much quicker than the M60. It felt like driving a sports car by comparison.
Well, it had the biggest petrol engine ever made. It
was also much more cramped than the M60. So on the inside, so they didn't have as much storage space.
That's an interesting comment because I have not been inside an M48 or an M60, but people who I've seen talking about M48s are generally surprised by the roominess.
They are, but there's not as much.
There's more roominess in the M60, sure, but yeah.
And which is one of the reasons why, because there wasn't as much storage space on the inside, they came to the idea of, well, we'll just throw stuff on the outside of the turret and the hull, which then became your ablative armour for setting off your RPGs and so forth. All right. The M48A5s handled pretty well. They were a bit more nimble and resistant to throwing track than the M60s, probably because they were lighter. The maintenance procedures were very much the same between the M60 and the M48s. The fire control system was very primitive. The rangefinder was a coincidence rangefinder with mechanical linkage to the analog fire control computer. So that's where we get back to a lot of knob twiddling and a dial twirling.
Yeah, I just think it was putting too much load on the operator from when I've seen people try and do these things.
But, I mean, you've got to think about it as a trained operator, after however many days or weeks of doing these things, will get very good at it. It just means that you have to have people who are trained to do it. You can't just throw in a soldier off the street who has never used one of these things before and say, okay, use the rangefinder to figure out how far that target is and put a round into it. No, that person's got to be trained. So that's where you get the idea of you're no longer using soldiers who don't have the background and can't do everything. They have to go through a training process, and that's where you get your professional military. Even though there was a lot of conscripts, so the US is based that they would put the time into the training of their tankers, and a lot of other countries who are using the M48s as well.
Fair enough.
All right.
Now we're getting into the conflicts, of which there are so many.
Well, we'll start off with the Cold War. Yes, it was 1947 when they declared the Cold War had started through to 1991. What a surprise. We'll go into some of the actions of note from the Cold War in a little bit.
Okay.
The 1958 Lebanon crisis. Now, this was a fun one for me to read.
I didn't actually know the Marines landed in Lebanon in 58. I only remember the 1980s.
No, that's what I'm saying. This is 58. This is basically the first deployment of the M48s. In July 1958, the US Marines deployed to Beirut and brought their M58s with them. M48s. However, on the initial landings, they weren't allowed to bring the ammo with them on the landing ships, as it was too dangerous for what was still considered a peacetime operation, as shown by the bikini-clad sunbathers who had to get out of the way of the Marines storming the beaches, and so started the US policy of intervention in the Middle East. This was the first time, 1958 was the first time the US was involved in the Middle East in a interventionist way, whereby they... And it was all a bit of a mess. Basically, they'd been invited.
Sorry, a US landing in Beirut was a mess, you say?
Yes. There are beautiful. There are photos of people in sun.
I wish you'd sent me a picture of that to put in the slideshow. But all right, yeah.
It was a real case of, yes, the Marines were storming the beaches of Beirut, and the people there didn't realise there was any sort of trouble going on. There was a bit of posturing between the various factions within Lebanon, of which there are many. We'll get to that in the other conflicts whereby the M48 is involved in Lebanon. But the people involved on the beaches at that stage didn't know what was going on, and there was a lot of confusion between what Eisenhower was announcing at 7 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning versus what the ambassador to Lebanon on the ground was saying to the government, and it's just all a bit of a mess. And as I say, they couldn't land with rounds in the tanks because it was still peacetime, and they weren't allowed to. It was just, a bit of a mess. Anyway, and from that point...
I mean, but when you think... it was M48s as well. You know, when the US landed in Vietnam, the Marines went over the beach, and the government in Saigon didn't know it was happening. They've got a bit of a habit of not
invading
actually,
first, and maybe they don't realise the time zone differences between.
Obviously, a lot of them know about time zone differences, but yeah.
All right, so John, we've got some more sound issues going. Try lowering the video bit rate. Still stuttering badly.
Okay, so for those who are giving us technical help, OBS is just providing the video. The audio is coming out of StreamYard. Earlier, I switched it to a different part of the USB bus, but we're not peaking at this end, so I think we're probably going to have to try and just keep going. And apologies that StreamYard is not doing what it's supposed to be doing with the audio.
It's not the USB bus thingy bob again. Is the mouse working?
The mouse is working, yeah. Well, it was. The mouse is still with us.
All right, so not everything has died. All right. Now, supposedly, the interwebs told me that the M48s were involved in the Portuguese colonial war of 1961 to 1974. However, Portugal didn't receive their M48s from West Germany until 1977. And they probably weren't supplied to the mainly communist alphabet soup forces opposing the Portuguese. I think there was the FNTLA, the FNTLI. There was all sorts of various groups with, as I said, alphabet soup names. However, when the interwebs was telling me that the M48s were involved, I thought, hang on a second, this doesn't really add up. But when I did some more looking into it, it looks like that the Portuguese were using M48 tracer rounds in the conflict. So that's probably why they're listed as being involved in the Portuguese colonial wars. I don't know otherwise, but could not see any sort of indication that where else they might have been used. But because, as I say, I can't see them having been supplied to those other groups. The Dominican Civil War, 1965. Again, I didn't see any M48s listed in the orbats of the participants of it, but the Marines did deploy with their ONTOSs, at least. We know that because that's when the ONTOSs and the AMX-13s took on each other. So they quite probably took the M48s with them, because M48s were basically the Marines' tank of choice, and would just be floating around with them in their floating floating support bases.
Mm-hmm.
And at the very least, they probably took some bridge layers and/or recovery vehicles with them. All right.
Yeah, that would probably account for it.
Vietnam War. Wow, what a surprise. M48s were present from 1965 all the way through till 1975, even after the US left. We will get into some of those actions a bit later. But yes, they were there the whole time.
I was really surprised by the condition, and there's at least one photo in the slideshow. Just this rusted out M48 up in the Highlands, still with a crew, sitting on top of it with all their lawn chairs and eskies on it.
And what year was that photo from?
I don't know. We'll see it when it comes up.
Okay.
But, it's in the mix. But they were not looking after at least some of the tanks they were
right.
Rumbling through the jungle with.
All right.
Anyway.
All right. The Arab-Israeli Six-Day War in 1967. They were also very present there. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. Guess what? They were there, and the Indo-Pakistani Wars of 1971. So they were present in both of those, all on the Pakistani sides. Yeah,
the Indians took great joy in piling the destroyed M48s in interesting ways. Yeah,
yes, in what's called Patton City. Yes. Anyway, the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Again, the Arab-Israelis. The Western Sahara War, which was basically a ongoing guerrilla activity from 1975 through to 1991, when the Kingdom of Morocco tried to claim the former Spanish territory after Spain left from North Africa, from the various nationalist tribes that were actually living there. So they said, well, the Spanish have left, we're going to retake these areas that we feel that 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago or 400 years ago belonged to us. So
I mean, the Moroccans did an amazing thing in that, where they just got 1 million Moroccans and just walked over the border and said, it's ours now.
Yeah, and we live here now.
Yeah.
What's that one from? We live here now.
Yeah.
Anyway, the Lebanese Civil War of the 1980s, which is where you get the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut. The Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1973. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, fun. The Battle of Mogadishu, 1993, as seen in Black Hawk Down.
Now, the Iran-Iraq War, they were on the Iranian side, I believe.
They were, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, well, they were on the Iraqi side when they captured them from the Iranians. Yeah, so, as I said, as we've seen in Black Hawk Down, at the end... the
Pakistanis rescue everyone.
Yep.
They really don't get enough credit in that movie for the fact that it was actually the Pakistanis. I mean, they get a bit of credit.
But, and then the Kurdish-Turkish conflict, which is from 1978 till ongoing. What a surprise! Because the Turks are still using them as tanks, and so they're still
The Turkish tank fleet is an astonishing thing. We should just do an episode on the Turkish tank fleet one day.
I reckon we should, because there are so many different. I mean, Leopards, Leopard 2s, K2s, Oplots? No. But I mean,
it's
M48s, M60s.
and they use them. They see a lot of combat.
I mean, yeah. I mean, and how do they divide? I mean, is it regional or reserve units have one, or they just say, you know what, we're just going to put 7 different tanks in each unit and see which one gets to the finish line. Right.
Yeah. Anyway, Turkish armour is a subject worthy of further study.
Right. And then the 2007 Lebanon conflict. So they've been involved in all those, and we'll talk about the operators and why they're and so forth. All right. Actions of note.
Right.
Oh, this is a fun one. Checkpoint Charlie, October 1961. Now, at this stage, for those who know, the West Germany and East Germany had been divided, but Berlin itself was also divided to East and West sectors. However, the agreement was in place that military and diplomatic staff and government staff from either side could go anywhere within the city, so east, west, wherever they liked, and because of that, there was treaties in place to let that happen. Now, at some stage or another, the East German police, not the Soviet army, but the East German police started cracking down on Western diplomats wandering across to East Germany, East Berlin.
To be fair to them, the Western diplomats were up to no good. You know.
They were being spies and everything. That was the whole point. But
fomenting unrest and putting big bags of cash in people's hands to do things they didn't want.
But the point is, eventually, and so because they started getting harassed by the East German police, the U.S. military said, well, we're not going to let that happen. So they started sending jeeps full of troops with them as they crossed the border, so they can wander around East Berlin wherever they liked, and the East German police couldn't tell them what to do. Otherwise, you'd have a bunch of squaddies with, a bunch of soldiers with bayonets fixed, trying to sort things out. So eventually, this is all kicked off in October 1961 when T-54s had a standoff with a bunch of M48s at Checkpoint Charlie. 100 metres away from each other, there were between 60 to 100 tanks lined up on the scene for 16 hours, nobody wanting to back down. And that was the point where they realised, the US and the Soviets realised that they really need to have a way of talking to each other, because the commanders on the ground were just following their set procedure and saying, if this happens, then we do this. If this happens, then we do that. And that escalated the situation. And eventually, Kennedy and Khrushchev decided...
that was why they set up the hotline.
Yeah, that's when they set up the hotline to say, can we just de-escalate this? And so...
But having said that, the hotline which lets the two presidents talk to each other, yes, good thing to have. Not actually still enormously helpful for soldier in the tank in Berlin.
It's going to take a while for him to get information. But this escalated just because some tanks turned up on one side, so some tanks had to turn up on the other side. And after 16 hours, it was started to de-escalate, whereby one tank from one side left, and so one tank from the other side left. And eventually they emptied the streets of these tanks, the T-54s and the M48s. So they were removed the next day, but showed the world how quickly things could go from very, very very bad. The U.S. Army even deployed the Davy Crockett, John. It was there in the streets. The Davy
Crockett was a tactical nuclear weapon with a blast radius of 800 meters and a range of 2.5 kilometers. So you had to use it. So that's straight from memory. I could be slightly wrong in the details, but that's the gist of it. So you had to be extremely careful not to blow yourself up firing this stupid recoilless rifle nuclear weapon.
Yep. Which could only go so far, because otherwise it would. So the Davy Crockett was deployed for that time. Yeah.
Can you imagine using tactical nukes in a city you're meant to be sharing?
And the incident that sparked it all was so a diplomat could go to the opera, supposedly. He wanted to go to they wanted to go to the opera, and the East German police were basically hassling them. And the opera house was in East Berlin.
We've all had a moment at work where we're doing something slightly selfish, but not actually wrong, and things just escalate completely out of hand.
Yeah.
And this was an extreme example.
Oh God, yeah. All right, Vietnam. Oh. I've used all over Vietnam, but we'll get into a few notable mentions. The Battle of Hue from January 31 to March 2nd of 1968, which was part of the Tet Offensive. Having infiltrated the city, the NVA and the Viet Cong took control of the city, but then allowed South Vietnamese and American forces to recapture the city rather than continuing their own attack. There's a great video out there of an M48 was involved in heavy street fighting on the 11th of Feb. And a camera crew was with them, with the troops, and captured the moment an RPG round exploded on the turret just as it was turning around a corner of a street. The RPG did not penetrate, and the tank was able to reverse back into cover.
There's a point about RPGs that's well worth covering here, because we've talked in the past about the Challenger that took 70 or more RPG rounds. RPG is a very versatile weapon, and a lot of the warheads are straight HE. And a lot of the stories of tanks surviving being hit by RPGs are almost certainly either training rounds or the high explosive round, and not the high explosive anti-tank round. And because if they've been hit with heat, their chances of survival really start to drop.
Yeah, I think it was mainly that it hit in the thickest part of the turret armor, which is why the tank survived, because it was otherwise I think it probably would have gone through, but it did hit on the thickest part of the turret.
Yeah, but if you're a Viet Cong insurgent, you're using the round you've got, not the ideal round.
Oh, no. And it was the way it was captured, just saying right there.
So, it would have been spectacular. And also, if it's an HE round, it makes for a better photo, because shape charges, unless you're using super slow-mo, don't actually look that exciting.
Shout out to the super slow-mo guys.
Yeah, no, they're just the slow-mo guys.
Slow-mo guys, okay.
Gavin Free is my hero. Yeah.
There you go. All right. So I was able to reverse back into cover. Unit records show that this vehicle took a total of 3 direct RPG hits by the end of that February, but was still operational. So RPGs were effective against Pattons. It's just obviously if you're shooting them in the thickest, the best point of the crews obviously knew to front towards enemy, so that it does also get to the right spot.
You need to know what actual round was on the front of the RPG.
Yeah, true. All right. When the US forces left Vietnam, they handed over 343 Pattons to the ARVN.
The Army of the Republic of Vietnam.
Yep. Which formed the 20th Tank Regiment. They fought a number
That's a lot of tanks for a regiment.
Sorry, there was also the 1st Armoured Brigade as well. Sure. There was basically, most of them went into that one.
Yeah.
They fought a number of battles with the NVA T-54-55s after the US left.
I mean, the doomed heroism of the ARVN from 73 to 75 is.
Well, this is 72, so
yeah, it's a bit of a sad story. That's kind of why no one likes to talk about it. But they fought frequently extremely bravely. But they were trying to prop up a collapsing regime in the face of a much better opponent.
Well, an opponent with a lot more political will and willing to throw people and resources into the battle, whereas they just wanted to get on with their lives.
I mean, but also the North Vietnamese army by the 1970s was a very effective fighting force.
Yes.
Yeah.
So during the first month of the first battle of Quang Tri, who knows how to...
that sounds all right.
Yeah, it sounds good enough. In April 1972, all the ARVN M48 Pattons, which was 100 tanks, were lost, including the first tanks lost.
That's a big tank battle by anyone's standards.
Well, it was over a number of days as the NVA, which is now called the PAVN, People's Army of Vietnam, crossed the demilitarized zone and started basically attacking the now handed over bases, the bases that had previously been used by the US troops and handed over to the South Vietnamese Army. The South Vietnamese Army fought well, but once they were flanked and the enemy was inside their bases, they broke and lost their tanks. It was as simple as that. And because the North Vietnamese Army were willing to carry out those activities, willing to put people into it.
There just comes a point when the Americans have disappeared and your own leadership is disappearing, and you as a soldier have to ask, how do I get my family out of here? Rather than, is this a hill I want to die on?
And as I said, this is the first time a tank was lost to an ATGM, an anti-tank guided missile.
What year was that?
1972, April 1972.
Oh, okay, so just getting in ahead of Yom Kippur.
Yes, which was these missiles were called the Saga.
Yes, the Sagas would also
appear at Yom Kippur. Yes, they made a big difference there. As the war continued without US involvement, the ARVN Pattons faced shortages of fuel, munitions, because the US Congress placed a ban on funding further supply of military equipment.
Yeah, so I hope folks in Ukraine have seen
that. Sound familiar to anyone that the US Congress says, look,
don't like this war anymore.
Yeah, it's broken.
Good luck, everyone.
We're not winning anymore. I don't want to play anymore. Taking my tanks and leaving my tanks and going home. All right, the American-made tanks soon ran out of ammunition and fuel and were quickly abandoned to the PAVN, the People's Army of Vietnam, which then put them in service after the war ended in May 1975. The US lost about 123 Pattons, non-repairable, so others that got blown up and then repaired.
Yeah, sometimes they hose the crew out and get them back in service.
Yes, there was a couple of comments on various channels about that. Plus another 343 given to the ARVN, which were destroyed or captured. And those captured, at least 30 of them, were only used briefly before being phased out and turned into war memorials or displays all over Vietnam.
It's really cool how you go back to like ancient Greek warfare. Setting up trophies of your enemy's armor was literally something they were doing in 600 BCE, and it is still a thing that people want to do. When they capture the enemy's armor, they put it on display and say, "Look, we did this. We got it."
There you go. All right. Some of the comments of tank users from Vietnam. I'm just throwing these in here because I found them very interesting and insightful, because basically there were people there and who were driving them and saying, well, why shouldn't their comments be spoken out loud? So supposedly the M48s were used in Vietnam not because M60s were unavailable or too heavy, but because there were millions of rounds of 90mm ammunition available, and it made sense to use it up as all the 105 rounds were headed for Europe.
That might have been a bit of a factor in the thinking, but there was also just the M60 was reserved for Europe, which was viewed as the main game for the real shooting war. Yeah.
Some of the US Marine Vietnam tankers talk about when they swapped in the new cupola. for the commander, and it didn't have an interrupter bar for the 50 cal, so you could easily shoot out the Xeon spotlight in front of you if you weren't looking at what you were doing. So you had a great big box on the front of the turret, and the commander sitting in his cupola with his 50 cal, and if you didn't have a little bar that stopped you traversing or aiming the gun down, you could put rounds straight through your
which it's
your great big Xeon box.
It's really funny because this was a problem that was solved at least in the 1940s.
In the the First World War, when you put interrupter bars on your airplanes.
Yeah, to stop you shooting your propeller. But I've actually seen in the what's the plane? The Hudson, which is a terrible bomber, but it had a rear turret, and I've actually seen the outline that was etched into the mechanism of the turret of the gun in the turret, so that if the gun was pointing in any way at a part of the plane which had been mapped out in this thing, it was going over a non-conductive surface, and there was no electrical current, it wouldn't fire. And then when the gun was pointing somewhere that was safe to fire, that wouldn't hit the plane, it had an electric current, and then the gun would fire. And that was definitely a 1940 design. So I'm saying this had been solved, and then they just said, we don't care.
I like to think of it as saying they obviously thought that soldiers and Marines were smarter than the airmen and wouldn't shoot their own vehicles, but they were wrong.
They were, and in the Lancaster bomber, they literally different way of doing the same thing. Just had a bulge in the fuselage that the barrel of the gun would rise over, so it wouldn't hit the tail. so there's a lot of ways to skin this cat, and none of them were used here.
There you go. Well, they obviously didn't think about it when they installed these things, and it was during them that it was given to them while they were in theatre. So they also customised their tanks depending on where they were stationed. In the north, on the demilitarised zone between North and South Vietnam, they faced much more artillery. In the south, it was much more to do with mortars from the local insurgents. So in the south, they swapped out the 30 cal coax with a 50 cal from the cupola somehow. So they got a 50 cal into the coax.
I've always wondered why the Americans kept going with mixing 30 cal and 50 cal in their tanks. Someone loved what the 30 cal did, but pretty much all Western vehicles these days just use 50 cal for the vehicle machine gun these days.
Yes.
Yeah.
And somehow they got the 50 cal inside the turret and linked up, or they would put extra 30 cals or even M60s, which machine guns, medium machine guns, on the outside of the tank, so that so they can use for extra firepower. So basically, they would load them up with more machine guns so that they could be running around and basically putting out fire to things.
I think Mardius is coming up on 100 years of service.
It has.
Yeah.
I read about that. I was watching. That was one of the things that came up while I was doing this research for today.
Yeah. So John Browning, it doesn't need me to say he's a genius, but I mean the fact that he was making a gun 100 years ago that is not replaceable with anything better is really an achievement.
Yeah, there you go. When they got to Vietnam, the US tankers didn't know what an RPG was until they arrived in '66.
It seems weird considering Panzerfausts had existed in World War II.
Yeah, I think it was more maybe what they were getting into. They probably didn't know the exact situation they were getting into.
Yeah, okay.
And there was lots of mention that at the start of the involvement of the US involvement, there was a lot of coordination between the infantry and the tankers because they had been doing a lot more training in America to work together. But that due to the continuing rotation of forces, the army and the infantry lost coordination between the two of them, which then made the tanks much more vulnerable to RPGs over time. So that's a real issue of basically if you're keeping people in country and you're reducing your training and coordination in preparation for sending people over there, then that's a bit of an issue for you.
It sort of just comes back to, I mean, Vietnam was the biggest self-inflicted wound. Well, it's hard to think of any empire creating a greater self-inflicted wound.
Dien Bien Phu.
Well, but that was sort of the end of French
Yeah, I
Empire. But remember, the legacy of Vietnam is that the US had to leave the gold standard to basically fundamentally let the Saudis be their paymasters, which is still causing enormous pain to the average American citizen. Leaving aside the damage to the millions of Vietnamese who were killed and the damage to that country. The damage to America from its involvement in Vietnam was enormous and long-lasting and completely unnecessary, and it makes me mad. But let's keep going about the M48.
Obviously, the monsoon season meant that the tanks lost just about all mobility. Because of the wetness of the roads and the rice paddies and everywhere else, and the sugarcane factory, sugarcane and basically anywhere that was not hard packed roads, you couldn't go through even with the tank, which is where helicopters came in. All right. Comments from an M48 A3 tank driver with the on the DMZ in Quang Tri, South Vietnam. The M48 was a very reliable and easily maintained tank. The entire power pack and engine and transmission could be removed and replaced in an hour or less. Had good mobility, even in muddy terrain, owing to the wide tracks, though due to its 53 American ton combat loaded weight, was not as agile as the M113.
Well, it was much heavier
because
it had armour, as opposed to the M113, which did not have armour, does not have armour.
Armour protection was near proof against the B40 RPG, and even a side armour hit from the RPG-7 was often stopped by the track blocks that we attached to the turret rail. A common storage container for the outside rear bustle rack was the M40 ammunition containers from the M42 Duster. Self-propelled anti-aircraft track. The type of main gun ammo that we used most was the canister, a gigantic 90mm shotgun round, both for close quarter anti-personnel work and jungle busting. I
mean, basically you fire a canister and you've gone from being in the middle of a jungle to having a clear field of fire.
Around, we used heat and HE, either fused quick for delay for bunker busting and beehive for longer range anti-personnel engagements when we had them in the open or behind light cover, and Willie Pete for smoke, which is white phosphorus, signalling and anti-personnel purposes. The beehive round had a variable range fuse that could be set to airburst over trenches or other fortifications. The MVA often fought from fortified positions on the demilitarized zone. We modified the external 50 cal machine gun mount by welding on salvaged coax machine gun floor ammo boxes that could hold a 500 round linked belt. Otherwise, that was a good point. Otherwise, the 50 cal could only hold a 50 round belt, so you could very quickly go through that. Whereas if you basically put more space on it, you could put on a 500 round belt.
What's the rate of fire on a 50 cal? Yeah, 50 round belt is not adequate.
Well, but you don't want to be. Look, I couldn't.
If you're holding the trigger down, and let's remember, men under stress.
Trigger, it's basically the
paddles.
The paddles, yeah. It's not as. It's not an MG42 round, speed type thing. It's a good dug type speed of fire.
Yeah.
But yes. So there was lots happening in Vietnam. There was lots of uses of the M48 used by both Marines and the Army. There was a couple at Khe Sanh, two at Khe Sanh that basically held the line quite well for them, putting out so much firepower that they were able to. Firebase Khe Sanh was attacked, I want to say April 68 or whatever it was. But
Yep. Fun fact for our American viewers is that one of the most popular songs in Australian musical history is called Khe Sanh, and there is no rational reason why Jimmy Buns, the singer...
Which is why I bring it up, because it is part of the Australian cultural heritage, that this is one of the most popular songs in Australia. From our youth.
A veteran who apparently left his heart to the sappers around Khe Sanh. But why an Australian was anywhere near Khe Sanh is a mystery that remains unknown to us.
Well, I mean, Australians were obviously involved in the war and had a big part to play in,
Not in Kaysan, though.
in Operation Santa Fe, which is about the only one I can see where they were clearing out an area around. We were much more involved in the southeast of Vietnam rather than the northwest where Khe Sanh was up against the Lao border. But yeah.
Anyway, for anyone who's interested, the band is called Chisel, the song is called Kaysan, and it's quite a good old school rock and roll song.
Rock anthem from the 80s.
Which involves a lot of describing sleeping with prostitutes. So,
but yeah, it's
a good song.
it's cultural, Australian cultural moment. All right, look, we're going to move on from Vietnam and all the M48s that were involved there. To the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965. So, US-built M47s and M48s formed the bulk of the Pakistani 1st Armoured Division by the eve of the 1965 Indo-Pakistani War and took part in the biggest tank battle since Kursk.
And also the reason why British people feel so smugly superior, because turned out their tanks were better than the American. It wasn't the only good tank the British built, but it was, this one moment of the British building a really good tank, and by which, of course, we're talking about Centurion. I shared it on our socials, but there was this video this week of an American evangelical church doing a tank crushing a bunch of cars in the middle of their Sunday worship, because that's what religion's all about.
What sort of tank was it?
It was a Centurion. But it had all these American flags, and America! That's a British tank!
Okay, that's pretty funny.
When you're crushing cars, you take the tank you've got. Yeah.
Anyway, so the biggest tank battle since Kursk. However, they won some and they lost others. All right, we'll start off with the ones they lost.
Mm-hmm.
The Battle of Asal Uttar from the 8th to the 10th of September 1965 in India, when the Indian Army lured the Pattons into a flooded sugarcane field and then let rip from three sides of them. We've talked about this with the, I want to say Centurion, but anyway, and then destroyed or captured over 100 tanks of the Pakistani army. So basically, they knew they were coming. They'd gone in the night before. They'd flooded this sugarcane field. When they lured them into advancing across this flooded plain, and then when they came up, they were in the Indian army were in a horseshoe formation around the Pattons and blew the hell out of them and destroyed this advance.
It's an interesting one. To what extent it was the superiority of the Centurion, or just that the Indians had a lot more smart guys being involved, and I don't know the answer to that completely, except that Centurion went on and on and on to win these engagements in the service of different countries, which suggests there was some superiority of the tank.
How many Centurions are in service still?
The Israelis got a couple.
I'd be surprised.
They got diesel engines in them, and they're
APCs, yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas M48 Pattons are in use all around the world.
Well, they were a younger design, but when they fought each other. But the issue for mine is that Centurion was not designed with a care in the world about NBC. No. It was highly optimized as a fighting vehicle. And my suspicion is that where the M48 came off second best against it was because it had been designed for a whole bunch of criteria that were not necessary in those conflicts. The other thing that I find really interesting is we have these Indo-Pak wars in the 60s. Apparently, US military thinkers just weren't looking at them at all, because it took Yom Kippur for them to wake up and say, oh, hang on, there's conventional warfare going on. Which sounds like raging racism, because if brown people are doing it, it's not worth spending any attention on. But if there's some white-ish people, then
I'll throw my 2 cents in there. If there was any sort of Russian involvement or Soviet involvement, they probably would have taken a look at it. But because it was Western tanks versus Western tanks, who cared? Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah, there you go. All right, so then we get to the Battle of Chawinda. which was the 18th to 19th of September 1965 in Pakistan, right? So that's where you had 220 Pattons and 15 Shermans versus 135 Centurions and 90 Shermans of the Indian Army. So
obviously the Shermans are the deciding criteria here. More Shermans, the better. Simple.
When the Pakistani army managed to halt the Indian advance in Pakistan, both sides pushing more reinforcements into the area. The Indian army had the numbers but could not break out. The Pakistani army was able to hold until the Indian army withdrew. Basically, there was a lot of battles here, and they lost. Everybody got ground down. All right. The Pakistani army then vetoed a proposed counterattack to take on the withdrawing Indian army due to heavy tank losses. Plus, they knew that a ceasefire was coming the next day or so, so why waste lives for nothing?
Which is a more sensible approach than a certain General Pershing used on the very last day of World War One, when he killed more American soldiers than the whole of D-Day.
Yeah. Numbers vary from the Battle of Chawinda, but some numbers are the Pakistani lost between 60, 105, 155 or 44 tanks to the Indian Army losing 100, 70 or 120 tanks. So
which set of numbers you choose really does colour how you view that engagement.
So basically it's a case of, you can see the neutral numbers are the ones in the middle. The opposite teams are the numbers on the on the ends. All right. Now, it's an interesting activity because Pakistan changed generals in the middle of their advance, right? So they've invaded India across a disputed border, and 4 days into it, they've stopped, changed generals, taken a day, and then started going again.
There are some generals, like, say, I don't know, Modal, who can just be parachuted in and fix things. That's what they do. There aren't that many modals in this world. I'd probably put Hannibal in the same category, but there aren't a lot. Generally, you need months in theatre with your troops, making sure you've got the training and equipment to do what you want to do.
It was a bit of a mess on both sides. So having done that, that gave the Indian Army time to move in reinforcements to get in position to stop the Pakistani advance across the disputed border. The Pakistani leadership, army leadership, also didn't believe that the Indian Army was preparing to cross the internationally recognised border as opposed to the disputed border. So there was one border that was disputed, that anybody could go back and forth and nobody would care. Then there was the internationally recognised border whereby if you cross that, that's war, boys and girls. That's a proper war. And Pakistan said, they'll never do it. They don't have the balls. So
for those in the video feed, we got the Checkpoint Charlie confrontation on the screen right now.
So when India did cross into Pakistan, across the international border, Pakistan was caught flat-footed and had to redirect their advance to secure their flanks. So basically, they've gone this way, we've gone that way, and basically they've had to turn around and come back, type thing. The Indian Army and the Indian Air Force failed to coordinate their advance across the international border, and so lost any benefits the Indian Air Force could have provided by catching the Pakistani Air Force on the ground. The Pakistani Air Force, who were then proved very valuable as close air support to halt the Indian Army advance as it was going. It was all pretty much a mess that was ego and ideologically driven rather than a military or strategic exercise.
You do get a real issue, though, that if you start coordinating with the Air Force, the chance of the enemy finding out about it, and this isn't a diss on Air Forces
the enemy knew. Nobody listened.
Yeah, but
the enemy knew this was going to happen.
It's a bit like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They'd kept such good operational security around it that the Russian troops didn't know they were about to invade Ukraine and hadn't had time to buy food. So it's really hard when you're trying to maintain security around your operation to then actually have everyone as well informed as they need to be. It's a tricky issue.
So, as I was saying about the ideologically and ego-driven military attack rather than anything thought out very worthwhile, a lot of the times, a lot of the rhetoric around the point was each Pakistani soldier was worth 10 Indian soldiers, or Hindu morale could not stand more than a couple of hard blows at the right time and place, and they will crumble. However, the Indian Army captured or destroyed so many Patton tanks that they brought them all together as a memorial to the war at a place they call Patton City.
That's very mean of the Indians. They're just mean.
From there, they were then dispersed around the country as trophies and memorials of victories. And September 20th is seen as a day of celebration in India for the victory of the war. Basically, they kept the Pakistanis out from achieving all their goals. Now, John, do we want to take a break there, or do we want to keep going?
Look, just one thing I want to note is that when you're trying to pass out Indian-Pakistani relations, which are complex and far more complex than this podcast can go to, you got to remember that basically the Mughals, who were, broadly speaking, the Pakistanis, had invaded in, I think, the 16th century, and India had been unhappily under the rule of these Muslim invaders from the north when the British arrived and said, hey, we can help you out here.
Well, I thought the British always liked dealing with the Mughals because they have a nice hierarchy and say that way they don't have to deal with people. They can just go to the guy at the top and say, hey, if you want to stay in power, we'll give you stuff. We'll keep you in power if you give us everything your country earns.
The British were unbelievably good at divide and conquer.
It wasn't go to divide and conquer; it was go to the top and conquer.
Yeah, but they also kept the Indians divided against each other. But a big part of what they were doing as well was that the general Indian Hindu population was not thrilled about the fact that its government was a Muslim hierarchy imported from. Broadly speaking, essentially what we now think of as Pakistan. So it's there's a lot going on there, and it's got nothing to do with tanks. So let's move on. But I think it is worth noting for our audience that there's a lot of complexity there if you want to dive into it. So go for that. Now, I think what Rob's trying to tell me is that he really needs to wee.
No, I'm all right.
Okay, all right.
We're out of beer though, John. And we're whether or not this beer will last to the end of the next section.
Let's keep going, and we'll finish the beers, and then we'll.
These are important discussions, boys and girls, of how we plan our days. All right, the 6 Day War. In 1967, Israeli upgraded...
Sorry, Tasman wanted us to talk about the 6 Day War, so Tasman, this one's for you, man.
All right, in 1967, Israeli upgraded M48s with the 105mm L7 gun, not the M68, the L7, right, engaged in the Sinai sector.
Oh, that's a really interesting distinction. Yeah, okay, because the American M48s got a licensed build of the L7, but it was the American, M60 you were saying? Sorry, what do they call that gun? The American
M68.
Build? M68.
Yes.
Okay, but the Israelis in 67 were using the 105s with the actual L7. Okay.
Right. So
now I get what that distinction's all about. Okay.
Right. Engaged in the Sinai sector, mauled down dozens of Egyptian T-34s and Su-100s at the Second Battle of Abu Aghalia, but lost 50 of their own Pattons out of 117. Again, probably a lot of those were from burning out through hydraulic fluid catching fire.
Jesus, that's grim. Yep.
On the West Bank front, Jordanian M48s were defeated by M51 Super Shermans, firing heat rounds from their French 105mm guns, not L7s, along with Centurions with L7s. So, lots of combinations of different barrels, but all firing the same ammunition, probably.
Yeah, okay. And, it comes all down to just what a game-changing... I mean, the L7 was the dominant tank gun for... nearly 40 years. It's, astonishing.
Right. All right. Combined with a very efficient air support from the Israeli Air Force, the IDF managed to capture 100 Jordanian M48s, their own Pattons, which were later then upgraded and pressed into service. So they took a lot of their Jordanian M48s and put them, changed them to specialist engineering vehicles.
It'd be a bit grim when you're assigned to a tank. Well, where'd this one come from? Oh, yeah, we blew it up from the... There you go.
like to think about this one. So on the Egyptian front, they had the Israelis had their M48 Pattons on the Egyptian front. The Jordanians had their M48s on the West Bank front, so that you wouldn't get M48 on M48 action, because that would be a bit confusing for everybody. So why was there? I mean, was that a strategic thinking, or was it just a case of that unit has M48s and they're in the south, and that unit has Shermans, Super Shermans and Centurions, and they're on the West Bank? I don't know, but that's the way it turned out.
I also like the way that the M48 with the 105 gun sort of became a pseudo tank destroyer, because it was very much used and sent out to destroy enemy armor.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's where we're getting into.
I mean, it had one of the world's best anti-tank guns, so why not? It makes sense.
At that point, we're going to come back. We're going to go to...
Okay, enjoy 25 minutes of me talking about George Patton, and then we will come back and finish up the M48 and
with Yom Kippur.
Yep, and then we've got a couple of other things to talk about that are tank related. So yeah, okay, folks. Let's see if I can make this bit happen without breaking everything.
And then we'll come back and hopefully with better sound.
G'day, folks. This segment gets recorded as a halftime break in our main live stream while we make room for more beer in the second half. Just for the context of anyone coming across it on YouTube. In this case, the episode is about the M48 Patton, hence this deep dive into the man the tank was named after. George Smith Patton Jr. was a lot of things. A narcissist, an innovator, a bully, an inspiring leader, a lunatic, an athlete, a nepo baby, and a truly great general. As there remains to this day a General George Patton Museum at Fort Knox in Kentucky, and a large body of active scholarship devoted to his memory, there are no shortage of gilded accounts of his life. But here we're going to try and pass out the good, of which there was no shortage, with the bad, which is significant. I just want to be very clear that none of the criticisms we might level at George Patton are a slight on the soldiers who served in the Third Army. A fair number of Patton's greatest triumphs had more to do with the lower ranks of that army than are given credit by the Patton myths. Patton was born on November 11, 1885, a weirdly significant date in hindsight. While we think of him as a very 20th century figure, it's worth remembering that his formative years were in the Victorian era, and there were no shortage of US Civil War veterans in his upbringing, most of them from the losing side. Patton's family were real, old-school establishment money. His family claimed no less than 16 of his ancestors were signatories of the, wait for it, no, it wasn't the Declaration of Independence. They're hanging this hat on the goddamn Magna Carta, signed by barons in 1215. His grandfather, George S. Patton Sr., was a colonel in the Confederate Army who died in the service of that cause. Patton's uncle, Waller T. Patton, died at Gettysburg commanding the 7th Virginia Infantry in Pickett's charge. George S. Patton, the father, was too young to fight for slavery and the rights of plantation owners, but studied at the Virginia Military Institute before becoming a lawyer in California and the mayor of San Marino, one of the wealthiest cities in the United States in terms of household income. In fact, when you include George C. Scott, who played Patton in the 1970 movie, there's altogether too many Georges in this story. As a young man, Patton struggled with reading, something he very much overcame in later life, and his academic career was poor to middling, despite his teachers describing him as bright. Any underachievers watching will sympathise. To give a sense of how juiced up the young Patton was in the establishment, his sister was engaged for a time to General John Pershing. Or, to put it another way, his favourite sports were polo, yachting, and sword fencing. And yes, for the sword nerds, I know it's just fencing, but I'm trying to be clear for folks who don't have your knowledge. At the Virginia Military Institute, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather, he was no good with reading and writing, but apparently excelled in uniform and appearance inspection, as well as military drill. All hat and no cattle, some would say. The US Senator for California, Thomas R. Bard, nominated Patton to West Point, where he started in 1905. And in that unforgiving academic environment, drill and spit polish could not carry young George through, and he was forced to repeat his first year. Football was a brief flirtation, but he kept getting injured, so he took up sword fencing and track and field, which led to a career in modern pentathlon. That is the Olympic sport combining swimming, horse riding, fencing, running, and pistol shooting, or things white rich people like. Really should have a yachting category in there too, shouldn't they? In 1909, Patton graduated in the middle of his class and was commissioned into the cavalry. Let's note he was a few years older than the class the stars fell on, who graduated in 1915. So began a long period of George doing whatever the hell he wanted. If he was assigned a posting he didn't like, then he'd make a pest of himself at the highest levels until something better was made available for him. And one infers some other poor bastard with parents who weren't as well connected had to go and do the job George didn't want at short notice. In 1910, aged 24, Patton married Beatrice Banning Eyre of the Baltimore industrialist Eyre family. The Eyres were big in coal, textiles, and medicines. Beatrice was herself a formidable woman and would die in 1953 after falling off a horse in a fox hunt. In 1912, George was selected to represent the USA in his beloved pentathlon at the Stockholm Olympics. For a sense of how things worked back then, the 42 pentathlon competitors that year were all officers from their respective countries. The first 4 places in the competition were all won by Swedes on their home turf, with Patton placing 5th as the highest-ranking non-Swede. Controversially, while all the other entrants used .22 caliber sporting pistols for that section, George came in waving a .38 caliber US Army issue pistol, tearing huge holes in the target, and it's possible to likely he lost crucial points with follow-up shots not being detectable due to the enormous bullet holes he was making in the target. These days a moving backdrop is used to prevent this problem. Credit where it is due, Patton showed good sportsmanship throughout this, despite the likelihood he would have won an Olympic medal. On the other hand, if he'd trained with and brought the appropriate firearm, he could have avoided the problem. As a young and very wealthy gentleman of the time, Patton didn't come straight home after the Olympics, but went to Saumur in France to study fencing with a French Army Master of Arms. Returning home with these lessons, he took a gig at the office of the Army Chief of Staff and rewrote the US Cavalry Sabre combat doctrine, designing the Model 1913 Cavalry Sabre. By all accounts, this is an extremely good thrusting sword. As a broad rule in sword fighting, novices thrash like monkeys swinging an antelope thigh bone in Olduvai Gorge. It's instinctive, whereas killers have the learned behaviour of thrusting with the point, which is more usually fatal. At the Mounted Service School in Fort Riley, Kansas, Patton invented for himself the title of Master of the Sword for the school's top instructor in swordsmanship. No guesses who that was. In 1915, he was supposed to go to the Philippines, but fancied action in Mexico more. So after 11 days of calling in family favours in Washington, he was assigned to the 8th Cavalry at Fort Bliss in Texas. This period is instructive because the young Patton was an unusual combination of privilege and opportunity, but also the talent to seize and make the most of those astonishing chances he was given. As Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, opportunities multiply as they are seized. Perhaps a fitting epitaph to George Patton's whole life and career. In 1915, still a lieutenant in Sierra Blanca, George decided he didn't need to wear his M1911 Colt 45 in a holster, preferring to stick it in his belt. There's a reason holsters exist, and Patton's gun went off in a bar. This led to his famous love of revolvers, particularly ivory-handled ones, which needed a bit more cocking before careless wear gets someone killed. But let's dwell a second on the idiot young officer who took an insecurely carried firearm into a goddamn bar where it underwent an accidental discharge. Patton again used his influence to get himself assigned as Pershing's personal aide for the Pancho Villa expedition. Pershing was apparently very impressed by the young lieutenant, and that had nothing to do with the upcoming engagement to the young Anne Patton, George's sister. On May 14, 1916, Patton led the first motorised attack in the US Army's history, killing 3 of Pancho Villa's men. Patton would take the nickname Bandito for his bandit-killing exploit, and I have no idea if he chose that for himself. The expedition also marked a lifelong interest in intelligence gathering, where Patton appeared to be much better than his colleagues at figuring out where the enemy was. Put a pin in that, we'll get back to it. May 15, 1917 saw Patton promoted to captain and joining Pershing's staff for the American Expeditionary Forces bound for France and the Western Front of World War One. Nothing to do with his sister being engaged to Pershing, of course. To be fair, he'd previously studied in France, which probably stood him in good stead. George got bored in France commanding the headquarters company and wandered off to see what the French were doing with tanks. On 10 November 1917, he got himself assigned to establish a light tank school for the American forces, who had zero knowledge or experience of the vehicles. This led to him spending time with the French tank training school and becoming the first American to drive a tank. Old blood and guts was really right there at the start. The Battle of Cambrai on 20 November 1917 was a seminal moment in tank history, and Patton was briefed by the British tank theorist J.F.C. Fuller on the results. Patton was promoted to Major on Australia Day, 26 January 1918, and his tank school received its first 10 Renault FTs on 23 March 1918. When the train carrying the tanks turned up at the siding, there was a problem. No one else knew how to drive a tank, and Major Patton had to unload the first 7 of them before someone else was able to give it a go. In August 1918, the now Lieutenant Colonel Patton was placed in charge of the US 1st Provisional Tank Brigade. At the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, starting on 12 September, Patton walked in front of his tanks to lead them into the German-held village of Essy, impressing a certain Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur, who he met for the first time. In the attack into Pan, Patton rode on the top of his tanks, directing the force. On 26 September, as part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he was wounded leading an attack on machine guns at Cheppy. His orderly, Private First Class Joe Angelo, saved his life. In this engagement, Patton himself would later claim to have murdered a US soldier who refused to dig a trench, hitting the soldier over the head with a shovel. The war would end on Patton's 33rd birthday, and he would be awarded a big stack of medals and promotions. In the interwar years, Patton was asked to write the manual on tank operations. With little interest in his job as a peacetime staff officer, Patton kept himself busy writing technical papers. He was certain that the future of tanks was as an independent fighting force, not just supporting the infantry. In 1932, Patton led troops of the 3rd Cavalry into Washington, D.C. to aid MacArthur in suppressing the bonus army of desperate, impoverished veterans. Patton would write how much he didn't like doing it, but he sure as hell did do it. And it's not as if he didn't have the money to support himself if he had taken a stand. Leading the 3rd Cavalry down Pennsylvania Avenue with tear gas and bayonets, Patton realised one of the protesters was Joe Angelo, the orderly who'd saved his life at Cheppy. Concerned it would be bad press for him, he shouted at Angelo to get out of there, which Angelo apparently agreed to. In 1935, based in Hawaii, Patton spent a lot of time bitching and moaning that there wasn't a good war for him to fight, and wrote up a plan to imprison the Japanese-descended American citizens in Hawaii in the event of a conflict. He took time from this important work to drink heavily and have an affair with his niece. To be fair, his niece by marriage, not blood. She was 30 years younger than him. His on-again, off-again affair with Jean Gordon is a tragic business we will come back to. Patton's boosters to this day try and argue that there was nothing physical in the affair, but given that Patton widely boasted about the physical nature of the affair, and his wife definitely thought it was real, the doubts seem to be little more than wishful thinking. There's one other thing to note about this relationship, and we will get back to it at the end. George having wrecked his yacht Arcturus, Beatrice Patton decided to cheer him up by commissioning the world's greatest marine architect, John Alden, to build him a 43-ton schooner. The yacht was called When and If, in the hope of a time George could sail it around the world. I mention this in part because it shows just the huge amounts of money these two had. Not many peacetime colonels have this sort of yacht money. Patton was heavily involved in the massive manoeuvres held by the US Army from 1939 to 1941 as the lessons from World War II in Europe were digested. In these exercises, Patton wanted to get a better understanding of how mechanised forces moved. To this end, he went and learned to fly, earning a pilot's licence, so he could fly himself over his forces and observe them. This is quite the mixture of ability, initiative, and having lots of money. On 4 April 1941, Patton was promoted to Major General commanding the 2nd Armoured Division. And yes, I'm skipping some steps. On 8 November 1942, Patton led the landing of US forces at Casablanca as part of Operation Torch. Following the poor showing of the US 2 Corps at Kasserine Pass, Patton took command with the new rank of Lieutenant General. Patton invigorated his command, demanding spotless uniforms and adherence to protocol. His orders for an attack on Gafsa included him writing, "I expect to see such casualties among officers, particularly staff officers, as will convince me that a serious effort has been made to capture this objective." In itself, this is a bit of a weird KPI, but for getting a demoralised force going forward again, it probably had the desired effect. If the staff officers are up the front, they're not really doing their main jobs, but there's a better chance of the frontline soldiers getting enough food and ammunition. This also marked the start of Patton's constant fighting and sniping with British commanders, joining the now decades-long argument as to whether the Royal Air Force should be doing close air support of engaged troops or focus on enemy fuel supplies and other logistics. From North Africa, Patton moved on to the invasion of Sicily and began the conflict with British General Bernard Montgomery that would define the rest of his life. In Sicily, his troops carried out the Biscari massacre of prisoners of war, and Patton's response was damning of himself. "I told Bradley that it was probably an exaggeration, but in any case, to tell the officer to certify that the dead men were snipers, or had attempted to escape, or something, as it would make a stink in the press and also would make the civilians mad. Anyhow, they are dead, so nothing can be done about it." In Sicily, when not covering up war crimes or doing important general stuff, Patton found time to get down to the hospitals and slap and abuse shell-shocked soldiers. This was too much, and Eisenhower forced Patton to apologise to the soldiers concerned and to the witnesses of his behaviour. Efforts to keep the story out of the media failed. Not everyone in the US Army loved Patton, and he was stood down from active commands for 11 months. In this time, particularly galling for Patton was the promotion of his subordinate, Omar Bradley, over his head to command the 1st United States Army for Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings. January 26, Australia Day again, 1944, saw Patton take command of the US 3rd Army in England with responsibility to get them trained for combat. He would take time out from the 3rd Army to be the fictional commander of the misinformation grouping known as the 1st United States Army Group. Note the word group at the end of that. The US 1st Army was very real. The 1st United States Army Group was not. This was part of a mess of decoys and signals intelligence that succeeded in convincing the Germans that the Allied landings would come at the Pas de Calais and not the Normandy beaches. On 1 August 1944, Patton's 3rd Army became operational on the western flank of Allied forces in France. This was the moment George Patton had lived his entire life for. The 3rd Army would achieve astounding feats in France and Germany. The 3rd Army used far more intelligence officers than other Allied armies, and also used light-spotting aircraft in the skies to direct artillery, combat air patrols over their columns, and constant pressure on the Germans to deny them the chance to reorganise and fortify. The only way Eisenhower could keep Patton on the chain was to limit his supplies of fuel, and on at least one occasion, 3rd Army officers would pretend to be from the 1st Army to steal thousands of gallons of gasoline. To be fair to Eisenhower, he did not want one single army to open up long flanks by being overextended. Eisenhower preferred to advance over a broad front. And if there's one thing German generals in World War II were extremely good at, it was cutting off overextended forces. The concern was extremely real. Patton's greatest moment came at the Battle of the Bulge, where his superb staff work allowed the 3rd Army to pivot to the rescue of the 101st Airborne Division. No other Allied leaders believed they were capable of the feat, but they pulled it off. To give some scale of the accomplishment, there were 133,000 3rd Army vehicles that had to be minutely planned to travel through rural France and Belgium without the whole column bogging down in traffic jams. Oh, and they had to fight the German army too in the middle of winter. Before the relief of Bastogne, Patton ordered the army chaplain to compose a prayer for good weather. When the skies cleared, he awarded the chaplain the Bronze Star. From January 29, 1945 to March 22nd, the 3rd Army destroyed the German 1st and 7th Armies. Patton crossed the Rhine River on 26 March, boasting that he had stopped to piss in the river as he went over the pontoon bridge. That day, he also sent the 314 men of Task Force Baum to their deaths in an attempt to liberate his son-in-law, Lieutenant John Waters, from a POW camp. 35 of those men came back from this frolic. But the Third Army and Patton have to be given enormous credit for their advance from the Rhine to the Elbe River. From August 1, 1944 to May 9, 1945, 47,500 of the enemy were killed, 115,700 were wounded, and 1,280,688 were captured. And to give a sense of scale, the Third Army was around 300,000 men. With the war ending in Europe, Patton desperately lobbied to be transferred to the Pacific. And for the sake of the timeline, Jean Gordon renewed their affair from 1944, and she was also having an affair with a young married captain to make things extra scandalous. In June 1945, Patton gave a speech in Boston to a huge crowd, including Third Army veterans, and some video of that survives.
Your Honor, the Mayor, General Doolittle, soldiers, ladies and gentlemen, coming over here, there was a very great lesson. The first 4 hours, we passed over a destroyed land, utterly destroyed. You who have not seen it do not know what hell looks like from the top. That's what Germany looks like. That Austria looks like. That's what any place that the 8th Air Force and the 3rd Army worked on looks like. You must remember this, that from Brest to various towns in southern Germany and Austria, whose names I can't pronounce, but whose places I have removed. The trail of the 3rd Army and the 19th Tactical Air Command and the 8th Air Force is marked by more than 40,000 white crosses, 40,000 dead Americans.
The end of the conflict gave him a bleak view. Yet another war has come to an end, and with it, my usefulness to the world. Returning to Europe, he was made governor of Bavaria with a particular task of denazifying the province, a role he did not approach with his customary drive. Patton took time out from Jean to write to his wife, "I had never heard that we fought to denazify Germany. Live and learn. What we are doing is to utterly destroy the only semi-modern state in Europe so that Russia can swallow the whole. Actually, the Germans are the only decent people in Europe." His behaviour towards the Jews in Bavaria was appalling, keeping them held in concentration camps so as not to have them upsetting the German citizenry, banning Jewish chaplains from his headquarters, writing about the dirty and smelly nature of imprisoned concentration camp survivors, and writing, "There is a very Semitic influence in the press. The noise against me is only the means by which the Jews and the communists are attempting, and with good success, the further dismemberment of Germany." Eisenhower ordered Patton to correct his statements in favour of the Bavarian Nazis, and George used the chance to double down on his beliefs. On 28 September, he was relieved of the military governorship, and on 7 October was further removed from command of the Third Army. He was sent to command the 15th Army, but that was just a headquarters staff writing a history of the war. With Eisenhower returning to Washington, Patton got the 60th birthday gift of being made interim commander of the US Army Europe for a couple of weeks. Then on 9 December 1945, out on a hunting trip, George Patton's Cadillac limousine collided with an army truck. There is an irony here that before D-Day he'd addressed the Third Army saying, "The two most dangerous weapons the Germans have are our own armoured half-track and jeep. The half-track, because the boys in it go all heroic, thinking they are in a tank. The jeep, because we have so many god-awful drivers." He was paralysed from the neck down and died on 21 December at the age of 60. So what to make of George Patton? He was a man of rare accomplishments who excelled at the highest levels of multiple fields. He was an excellent manager of large, complex operations. He was also a raging arsehole, and his ongoing influence justifying other raging arseholes' behaviour remains pernicious to this day. But it cannot be questioned that he created, if not alone, then certainly in large part, the US armoured forces that would thunder across Germany to defeat the Nazis. And to have both created the force and then to have led it is a unique achievement. And we have the beloved line from the 1970 movie.
I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country.
While we talk about that, George C. Scott refused his Academy Award win from the Patton movie on the basis that acting performances should not be ranked. The Oscar statue was given to the Patton Museum. More tragically, Jean Gordon killed herself 2 weeks after Patton's death, surrounded by pictures of him. His yacht, When and If, stayed in the Air family for many years before being donated in 1972 for use as a sail training vessel for children with dyslexia, a lovely nod to Patton's trouble with reading as a young man. The yacht was nearly lost in the storm in 1990, but was salvaged and relaunched in 1994. Here's a picture of her taken in 2017. She regularly takes part in sail training and tall ships festivals and offers public and private charters from her home port in Key West. While the Patton series of tanks were not perfect, they were certainly a fitting tribute to the dynamo in every sense that was George S. Patton. For both, despite their imperfections, you'd be nervous taking them on in a fight. Hey, so we're back.
Yay. Please let us know if this is not working again. We're having so much fun over here. But we have beer, and that makes everything fun. Yay! All right, getting back to the M48 Patton. Oh, sorry. Let's talk about John's brilliant presentation on General Patton. Just remember, Boys from the Dwarf, Rimmer had one of his most prized possessions was a vial of George S. Patton's cyanal fluid as one of his things on the Red Dwarf. I just want to throw that out there because it's important to me to just remember where my roots are at.
Yeah, which is Red Dwarf. For our American audience, you can probably get it on, I don't know, Netflix. Just search Red Dwarf. Certainly the first 4 seasons.
I'm just waiting for the next one.
Yeah.
35 years later.
Yeah, well, anyway. George Patton, I knew he was bad before I started this. I've been in a deep state of depression since about just how terrible he was. Just appallingly awful. And it's, if they had removed him, they had other generals who could have done the job. He was not indispensable. He was damn good at what he did. Not taking that away, but he wasn't indispensable, and just appalling.
I still remember reading many years ago H. Norman Schwarzkopf's biography saying when he became a 3rd-star general and it was all gung-ho and saying how good it was, and somebody, as 43 of them were flying to the Pentagon or Congress to be sworn in or whatever it was, and one of the 4-star generals up the front stood up and said, just so you know, if this plane goes down and you all die, we'll have another 43 3-star generals on the plane tomorrow. So you are not indispensable. You will be replaced straight away. And it was that message of you are replaceable from an organisation was a good one, I thought.
There was a British drama series in the, I think, late 80s called The Monocled Mutineer about the Western Front in World War One. And there was a beautiful line when the monocled mutineer was going past a graveyard in France and said to someone else in the car, every single person in that graveyard thought they were indispensable.
Anyway, back to the M48 Patton and Yom Kippur. All right, so 1973, where I've just learned that Cuba and North Korea had troops fighting on the Arab side. I didn't know that. Did you? Well, so Cuba looks to have deployed about 500 to 1,000, so maybe 2 battalions worth of infantry on the Arab side, whereas North Korea sent over 20 pilots who were flying MiG-21s against the Israeli F-4 Phantoms. Wow, that blew my mind a little bit.
I'd love to know how they did.
One of them got shot down by the Israelis and survived. Another one got shot down by the Egyptians' air defences and survived. So
yeah,
supposedly.
There was a moment in the Korean War when the Australian, I think the 707th Squadron, ended up they were flying Meteors, and they ended up fighting basically the Russian flying circus in MiG-15s. And
Meteors look very similar in a general.
It was
snub-nosed.
It was an enormous dogfight over North Korea, and the Australians were broadly defeated, but didn't take too many casualties. But it was a hell of a dogfight. Yeah.
All right, I'm just going to reach out to Philippine Dreams. Yes. Going out to the Philippines to look after cattle and cattle and goats and breed horses is Lister's quote, I'm pretty sure, in Fiji. And who wouldn't want to? Fiji's a beautiful place. Who would want to go there? Anyway. Yeah. Anyway,
continue.
Yom Kippur. All right, Israel started the war with 445 M48 tanks in 1973. From the 15th to the 18th of October of 1973, they were involved in the largest tank battle of the war, the Battle of the Chinese Farm. It was called the Chinese Farm because when the Israelis saw the Japanese engineering equipment at the farm and saw the characters on the equipment, they thought it was Chinese,
yeah, okay.
And so they labelled it on all their military maps as the Chinese Farm. The Egyptian forces had 157 T-55s and 75 T-62s against some 300 Israeli Pattons. After the initial Egyptian advance was halted and contained, the Israeli army counterattacked and were looking to cross the Suez Canal and put pressure upon Egypt itself.
They did cross the canal, I believe.
They did, but this is the battle that I'm talking about.
Sure.
So basically, Yom Kippur, the Egyptians had advanced, raced forward, smashing everything they could, and then realised they couldn't go very far. And so when they've stopped, the Israelis have regrouped and said, right, well, now we're going to counterattack and show them who's boss. So on the 15th and 16th of October, the Israelis crossed through the Egyptian defences and met limited resistance as they advanced with deception and manoeuvre. Basically, they did the old I'm going to hit you with this hand, but then swung around with the left hook, taking him, and were able to, before running into deeper Egyptian forces. So basically, they moved in, got past the initial defences with nobody noticing, and then ran into further deeper forces of the Egyptians who were dug in for defensive positions. The Egyptian forces started days of grinding combat, seeing their goals being almost achievable. The Israelis kept on pushing more reinforcements into the attack. So they thought, well, we've gotten this far. We are just about to break through and nobody's going to be able to stop us. So even though the Egyptian defenders were taking a large toll on the Israeli Defence Force, tanks and their infantry, with their own artillery, ATGMs, the Saga, and RPGs, the battle ended with an Israeli victory, with them crossing the canal and advancing towards Cairo and Suez City, whatever it is, the one at the bottom of the canal, when a ceasefire was imposed by the US and USSR. So that's getting back to what you were saying before about taking note of what battles were fought by by their tanks and who was involved. And that's what I'm saying, that it was only because the US and USSR imposed this ceasefire.
Look, okay.
Actually, no, I shouldn't say that, because the 71 Indo-Pakistani War was actually, a ceasefire was imposed via the Accords of Tashkent in Russia, actually, in the Soviet Union. Again, it was by those two forces, yeah. So,
but let's briefly touch on current affairs in Israel, grim and depressing as they are. Ronald Reagan could call up the Israeli Prime Minister and say, stop it right now, this is too much, your weapons and your money are going away if you don't stop it. George Bush Sr. did the same thing. why Joe Biden is incapable of making that phone call and is instead wanting to try and build a pier because the Israelis won't let,
aid in from north
the
or
aid
south.
in, and then the Israelis bomb the aid that's coming off the pier. Is something that only Joe Biden and his staff can answer, but previous US presidents have been capable of reining it in. And it is a real travesty that that is not happening. But anyway, let's move on and talk tanks.
Right. So both sides lost a huge number of tanks. Each side lost about 200 tanks. The flammable hydraulic fluid of the Pattons was discovered to be a severe vulnerability after the war. Only 200 M48s and M46 tanks remained to Israel after the war. Israel then entrenched most of these tanks on the Sinai front against opposite Egyptian infantry armed with 9 M14 Mayukita anti-tank missiles. All right, so basically they dug them in and said, right, we're not going to use them for maneuver, we're just going to use them as defensive bunkers from now on, and to maintain their position and holding the line. With these losses, the IDF, Israeli Defence Force, realised they could not maintain a strategic military advantage over their neighbours whilst taking such large losses of personnel and equipment, and started to change their focus to that of crew survivability and protection. So this is a real changing point for the Israelis to say, yes, we've got a military edge right now, but we've only got 7 million people in Israel, and we're not going to be able to, if we keep having these battles, we're going to get the attrition rate is going to means we're going to lose.
There's a couple of really interesting things to touch on here. One is the elusive chimera of glass armor that the M48 was involved in. We talked about it with the M60. Which was the Americans basically trying to create composite armor, and their pursuit of various forms of glass, which seems promising. You can see why they were trying to do it. Just didn't work out until the British came up with what we now call Chobham, or Dorchester, or whatever they're calling it today. But it's so they were trying to do that even back then to give the Patton actually really good armor instead of just enough armor, which is what they kind of sent it out with. But also you've got Yom Kippur as this reference war, which the Americans came out of saying actually a tank that can survive a hit by an enemy main battle tank round and keep fighting is achievable and is going to be valuable for actual conflicts we're going to fight. And that led directly to the M1 Abrams.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's move on to current operators of the M48 Patton. So people...
Also, Rob, we've got a beer problem.
We have a beer problem. All right. This is not the beer review beer.
Okay.
But it is the interim beer.
Interim beer.
It is the interim, like the M47 Patton, it is the interim beer. All right. Current operators of the M48 Patton. This day, Greece, 390. They still have... So they've got Leopard 1s, Leopard 2s, M48s. I'm sure they've got some other ones. Iran. They have 180 of them bought by the Shah back in the 70s. Or supposedly taken from Pakistan when they were sent to Iran for maintenance during the regime change, and they're not given back. So that's why Pakistan and Iran are, at this moment, having border conflicts. Missiles, bombs, bloody planes going across each other's borders and blowing up each other's towns.
Well, so everything's breaking loose at this point.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. But anyway, the Iranians have 180 M48 Pattons. Most of them have probably been changed to the 125 millimeter smoothbore gun of the Russian make.
So they're putting Russian smoothbores on Pattons?
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Lebanon, 104.
Poor old Lebanon's just taking whatever it's got. You know, They've got better things to do than fight wars. They've got beaches. They got chicks in bikinis.
They've got no power. They've got no water.
If you want to fight wars, you join Hezbollah and become the best light infantry in the world. So
All right, Lebanon. They have 104 M48 Pattons in service. Whether they still have as many of them as seem to have switched sides between various groups in Lebanon and Syria over the years. But they were mostly given back in 1994 and 2000, such as... So back in the 80s, the Lebanese government had tanks, and then certain militias formed around the area, such as the Lebanese Forces, which was the Christian faction. They got some of the tanks. The People's Liberation Army, which was the Socialist Druze faction. Then the South Lebanon Army, which was the Christian militia, or the Lebanese resistance movements, which was the Shia militias.
So I thought the Christian militia were funded by the Israelis as well, just to make things more complicated. But yeah, go on.
Anyway, what I'm saying is
there's a lot of
splitters.
Yep.
All right. There's a lot of these groups managed to get hold of M48 tanks. And during the peace accords of, 1994 between 1994 and 2000, they gave them back to the Lebanese army. So that's good, I think, maybe. Mm-hmm. All right. Morocco bought 225. And as I said before, they used them for trying to subdue Western Sahara. South Korea, they had 200 M48 A3s and 400 M48 A5s.
Now, it's worth noting the A5 is the version with the 105 gun. So A5, good M48. Anything else, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Taiwan had 550 with the M60 hull and an M48 turret, plus 309 phased out of service. So... They really mixed and matched there.
I would love to have someone explain to me why they did that, but I don't know. So let's keep going.
Yep. Thailand has 105 M48s running around.
Yep.
Turkey, 758 still in service, having phased out 1,389 other M48s. So they are still using these tanks in huge numbers.
Numbers that
beggars belief.
Yeah.
To a country that has 120 or something? Or what have we got?
Well, let's put it in perspective. Britain, one of the biggest economies in the world, 300 MBTs. Australia, up there in the top 10 economies in the world. I
don't think we make the top. I mean, Italy's...
Yeah.
I don't think we make the top 10.
My point is that very large economies have a couple of hundred tanks, right? Speaking very broadly. And the Turks have got just their M48 fleet in active service is 758, and they have all the other tanks as well. I mean, it's a lot of tanks.
All right. Mine clearing tanks still in service. Germany has 24 M48s. Poland has 4.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Former operators of the M48 Patton. U.S. Army, U.S. Marine Corps. Retired from service in combat in 1973, which was when they left Vietnam. Then used by the U.S. National Guard until 1987. And from 1987, they was then used as range targets until 1994. They were deployed all over the world. So while we say they were U.S. military tanks, they were deployed all over the U.S., all over the world with U.S. troops, even if not involved in conflicts, e.g. Korea, Japan, West Germany, Italy, and available on Marine Task Force groups wherever the sea took them. So it's not a case that they were only in the U.S. The U.S. had lots of bases during the Cold War, and that's where they were. Belgium, they only bought some bridge layers. Good on them. Iraq, only ad hoc use of captured Iranian M48s. Israel, they had 561 Magak Ram, which is their Ram. Magak means ram in Hebrew. They've gotten rid of all those because they said, look, there's no point having the M48s and the Makavas. We just want to have one tank that we're going to train and use and support and supply. So that's what they've gone to. Jordan had 200. Whether or not that was before or after various conflicts with...
Jordan just does what they're told by their big imperial powers. And fair enough, Australia does that too.
Yeah.
All right, so Norway had 38.
And then bought another 17.
Oh, well.
Yes. So Pakistan had 300. Now, I couldn't tell if this was what they had in service until 2002 or if it included all the losses from the wars with India. So they might have bought a bunch more and then lost them, or that's what they retired in 2002. Portugal, 86 from West Germany in 1977. As discussed, South Vietnam was given 343 from the US in 1972 when they left.
73, but yep.
Yep. When they were all destroyed or captured by the North Vietnamese, who used them on ad hoc basis after the war. North Vietnam sent them around the country to be set up as victory memorials. Spain had 164. Tunisia had 28. Germany had 1,692 in active service.
That's a lot.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about it, they had Leopard 1s and Leopard 2s by that stage in active service until 1993. So this was mostly with the reserve units after the introduction of the Leopard 1 and Leopard 2.
Now, I did get an account by a fella on one of our socials that I think it was their uncle had been in Fulda Gap and had seen the mission statement of the regiment, which was to hold the Russians for 10 minutes. But I would still say that if you're going to fight the Fulda Gap campaign, the M48 is actually the tank you want to be in because it's set up for the nuclear fallout, which none of the other ones are.
All right. Most international operators who kept the M48s beyond 1990 made significant upgrades to the vehicle, such as the upgraded fire control systems, the 105mm gun, thermal sights, gun stabilisation, ERA engines and transmissions. Versions, US versions. We're just going to talk about those ones. M48, developmental prototypes designed in 1950 and used between 51 and 55. The M48 initial production variant deemed not fit for combat use in Europe, relegated to continental United States use only for training, along with the M48C, which had the incorrect hull ballistic protection.
What do they mean by incorrect?
They did it wrong.
Wow, okay, cool.
The M48A1 was the first variant fitted with the M1 cupola with the external fuel drums to extend its range. The A2 redesigned hull with simplified suspension system and louvered engine access doors. So you can always tell the difference between what sort of rear doors they have. The M48A3 was where you introduced the diesel engine. The M48A4. Now, have you heard us mention the A4 at all?
No.
This time, John.
No,
which is where they took M60 turrets.
That's what those other buggers were up to. Right,
M60 turrets with the 105mm guns and put them on the M48A1 hulls. They were not used. That did not work. Huh. So rather than putting the M60 turrets, they just said, you know what, we're just going to put the gun in it.
Sounds like what we just talked about before, that other countries made it work, but the US did not make it work.
They were swapping the turrets around rather than just putting the gun in there.
Okay.
So they kept the M48 turret.
Sorry, there was one country, I think it might have been Taiwan, that we had up earlier that
definitely. Yes, they did. They did. They were swapping. They were using the M60 hulls
and putting the M48
turrets on.
Yeah. Oh, this is the other way around. Well, obviously that wouldn't work.
Right.
Okay.
The M48A5, where they installed the M68 105mm gun, converted to metric measurements. How's that for an American tank?
That's pretty exciting for an American tank to go metric. I would also note there was an interesting point when around the time when the M48 was coming to service that the US stopped using designations of heavy, medium and light for its tanks and tried to designate them by the gun they were carrying. And to me, that's a really interesting shift because when you're attacking, the weight of the tank is important because you need to get the bridging over the rivers. And when you're defending, the size of the gun is what you're interested in because you want to know what enemy tanks that are advancing you can destroy.
The actual vehicle is called the 90mm gun.
Yeah, because they'd moved to that system.
And if you've changed the gun to the 105, but it's still the M48A5. I mean,
well, you call it by the new gun, I would assume, because it's really important. The idea is that the general who's saying send them over here knows what they're doing, but it's a complete shift to the defensive to categorise the tank by its gun versus categorising it by its weight.
Yeah, there you go. All right. The M48A5 had the 105mm gun installed. They also got a Crew NBC protection system installed. They were relegated to the Army National Guard. And the QM48, which is when they became target practice from 1987 till 1994, which is when they were replaced in the role for target practice by the M60s from 1994. Variants: M48 armoured vehicle bridge layer, AVLB, which had a 60-foot, 18 metres scissors bridge. The M48 GAU-8, which is the prototype anti-aircraft vehicle with a GAU Avenger cannon. The M48 Tagash, which is the Israeli...
I believe the Avenger, is that not the cannon in the A10?
Yes, it's a huge, great big thing, yeah. 30 mil.
Not actually as good at penetrating armour as the A10 enthusiasts will have you know, but still a very powerful, very fast-firing cannon.
Yeah.
And,
the M48 Tagash, which is the Israeli bridge layer made from captured Jordanian M48s, and 2 tandem bridge sections rather than scissors. So rather than a fold out, it was just a case of sliding out.
So the really important thing here is that sliding out is what you want because the enemy can't see it. If you've got a scissor bridge, it goes up 20 metres in the air and everyone in the surrounding countryside can see that someone is trying to cross a river. Whereas if it just slides out, which is much harder to do, you're not alerting the countryside to your river crossing.
Israelis also found it was more useful because the tank ditches, which is what they were mainly trying to cross, were narrower than rivers or anything else, and would have high and low sides, and so they would be able to angle it to be able to land on a high side from one or from where they were deploying it. So whereas the scissor bridge would only go at a fairly shallow angle rather than being able to angle up and go to a higher point.
When we say angle up, we're talking about someone literally, creating a berm that the bridging tank can angle itself on and then just push the bridge out. Yeah.
The M67 flamethrower tank called the Zippo. What a surprise. An M48 armed with a flamethrower and a mock barrel. So
we have had that for those on the video feed and for anyone who's just listening on the audio, our social media, we will publish all the slides that are in the video feed.
All right. The M48 Minenraumpanzer Kieler, which is the German mine flower variant with upgraded German diesel engine. The M48 Marksman Spag, which is self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, basically, which is putting the British short-range anti-aircraft system with 2, how do you say that word, John?
Ehrlichen
35mm cannons onto the M48 hull, not accepted for US service. The M247 Sergeant York.
One of the great disasters of American defence procurement, the Sergeant York. But,
there you go. That's a good name. A short-range air defence system with 2 Bofors 40mm cannons mounted on the hull, cancelled by 1985.
What they basically discovered was that gun was a little too big for short-range anti-aircraft work. You needed something smaller and faster firing.
All right, there you go.
Yeah.
The M48 T5, which is TAMA, which is the Turkish combat support vehicles, based on the M48 hull, the armoured recovery vehicle with the front-mounted dozer blade and 70-ton winch, and the combat engineering vehicle, which is the same, but with a jib-mounted boom that can be fitted with various attachments to meet specific engineering requirements.
It's basically getting leverage on what you're trying to drag out of a ditch.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So, Rob, we're up to the beer review beer.
Now,
are you ready? Are you ready to tackle this? All right.
Let's do the patrons.
Let's put on. Okay. We'll put the patrons on,
and we'll get out. We'll drink some beer, and then we'll get to.
Yep, and we've got the new images, so that's very exciting for everyone who's watching. And I need to drink some beer. This is I don't know how we're going to do this.
We'll be fine.
We've timed this terribly.
Thank you very much to all our patrons, artificer and apprentice alike.
So, to quickly go through... we haven't written them in. Okay, well, they're on the screen.
That wasn't my job.
Yeah.
He does everything else, but that part was not my job.
So, in a second, the top tier patrons are going to swing past and I'm going to announce their names. It's very exciting that the Spanish M60s are for sale. Apparently, Ure, who is a fan of the show, reckons he knows where in Italy we can steal some M48s if we're keen. Top tier patrons: Brian Jenkins, Cornelius Weber, Ian McGuinness, Chris Peze, Jonathan Markle, Maxi Mixed. I think that's all of you guys. Apologies, Pear. There we go. And apprentice patrons, next tier patrons: Anton, Carter, Dan, David, Floody Burb, Guy Hook, Hans, Henry, J. Beckman Strauss, Jamie Stokes,
Jimmy O, Scotch 12,
Steve Matthews, Vikram. We've missed someone. We apologise. It doesn't mean we don't love and appreciate you.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
M60s for sale. $50,000, Rob.
US dollars.
Yeah.
Spanish M60s for sale. They're ex-Spanish Marine vehicles. Conditions not provided, not specified. If you want them, you can put in your bid to the Spanish military by 22nd of April and say, yeah, I'd like to have a tank, please. Whether or not that's is up to you to then figure out the export issues from there. So
what I find interesting is that around 1989, and I know about this because I thought about buying one.
The Centurions.
The Centurions went on sale for $25,000 each. We
were quite young.
Yeah, well, $25,000 was kind of what my friends were paying for cars at the time. Which is why I was like, well, instead of a car, maybe I should just buy a Centurion. But obviously, saner people prevailed, who weren't me, and said, don't be so stupid, John. Also, you don't have a driver's license. So
it was what, 23, 24?
I was 25 when I got my driver's license. Go. Yeah, I was late to the party. In my defence, I lived in London for 3 years of my adult life in that period.
I think it was more that you were in a south of Canberra.
Well, in a north.
In the north of Canberra, whereby
I rode my bike most places. Yeah. Yes, I was late getting my license. I don't drive very much these days, though, to be fair. Sheridan's got the car and she just drives it around. Although, if we're in the car together, she makes me drive and I'm like, I have not driven in 6 months. Good luck. Anyway, let's get back to tanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm interested in, though, is that back in 1990 around, a Centurion was going for $25,000. And today, which is over 35 years later, the M60 is going for $50,000. So tanks are getting cheaper. I'm just saying, if you got the money, but get yourself that M60. When you look at what older tanks are going for these days, just park it somewhere and keep the rust off it. That's a long-term investment.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Other things. Russia has apparently reconstituted its forces, and that's according to Kurt Campbell from.
I mean, you say reconstitute their forces. That's talking about, yes, they have reconstituted their armoured forces by taking a lot of T-62s out of storage and putting some ERA on the front, putting some lubricant in the various bits and pieces, fueling it up and saying it's good to go. That is not the same as saying your T-72 M whatevers.
Yeah, look, I think the Russians would be quite keen to go back in time and not fight the Ukraine war the way they fought it.
And not to mention that they are not going to be able to replace a number of the aircraft or helicopters that they've lost. And ships. Those are not coming in. Basically, what the Russian technology...
they've gone back to the 1980s.
Well, 2012, basically, the West was willing to sell them a lot of stuff up until they invaded Ukraine and Crimea in the first place in 2014. Up until that point, they had gained a lot of Western technology, and everybody said, "Oh, they're a democracy now. We can sell them anything. Yeah, there's no embargoes on what we sell them." And then 2014 came along, they invaded Ukraine. for the first time, and everybody said, okay, we're not doing that anymore. So it's a question of, they are limited in what they can achieve because they have the embargoes upon them. So I don't really see that as an equivalence of they've reconstituted. They have people power, they have
it's
old tanks.
What they have is the arithmetic of attrition, which is what we were talking about at the very start of the war, which is that Ukraine, with its early successes, needed to make a deal early, because if you keep fighting the bigger power for long enough, they get smarter and then they just crush you with size.
Yeah, which is being shown by the Russians' ability to build their own FPV drones, and they're using them more effectively
in their millions, now. Or Lancets,
using them more effectively now than the Ukrainians on the tactical front.
Okay, and just quickly, my trivia night. We've talked about this before. That if you're a tank nerd, you should join a trivia team. Your knowledge will be appreciated and valued, and it will be social interaction that you actually need. But my trivia night, Rob, can you believe the question was a picture question, and I go to a pretty advanced trivia night where we get little handouts with all these sorts of things, and it was of...
You usually win, don't you?
No, we don't win. No, this is a really...
Come on, that's not what I hear.
We have never won this trivia night. We came second last time we went, but and we've won some jackpot rounds, which are different deals. Trivia nights are very complicated. Anyway, it was the picture was from the movie Fury, with Brad Pitt sitting on a Sherman tank with the word Fury written on its barrel. And if Brad Pitt's sitting on a tank with a short back and sides haircut, that's Fury, right? This is a really easy ID. And my team members were like, "Oh no, maybe it's Monument Men. Do you think it's?" He
wasn't in Monument Men.
I know I know that, Rob. And my rage at being questioned on this, I just said it's a tank in the picture. And we had a bunch of new people.
What was the actual question?
The question was, what was the movie this picture was from?
Oh, God.
Yeah. So imagine my fury at being questioned on this. And then I heard one of the people at the other end of the table say, he runs a podcast about... So I'm like, it's got to take on... This is the thing that I know. This is my subject area.
Have a beer.
Okay, all right. Rob, talk about this beer while we get ready to pour it.
So, the other beer we were drinking before...
Talk about why we don't have an American beer. This is interesting to me.
This is a journey. We're on a journey here, right? So, before we had an interim beer, which like the M47 Patton, which was the Tumut River Brewing Company Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because being a proper nerd, when I couldn't find a proper American beer, I said, I like the name of that, and that is the selling point of this beer, and it was delightful. Tumut River Brewing Company is a good local brewing company, and I quite like their beers, and so I bought that one just because I needed a beer as an interim thing until I found the Prancing Pony Brewery Amber Ale, which is from South Australia, but it's an American style amber ale. And that was the closest I could get after visiting 3 different bottle shops in Canberra, saying, okay, we've done Coors, we've done Michelob, we've done
Bud. I
need something else. Sierra Nevadas, nobody had anything close. No James Adams, nothing.
No Russian River. Sam Adams.
Sam Adams.
Anyway, so we have an Adelaide brewery standing in. And
now, Prancing Pony, for those who think about it, is another wonderful nerd reference of the Prancing Pony from Brie, which is the pub where the Hobbits go to.
This is a murky brown ale.
Very.
I would not be thrilled if I'd made this and it was this level of clarity. I've met the Prancing Pony people. They're incredibly proud they don't use adjuncts in their brewing, which is a reasonable thing to be proud of.
Really tame, always reliable, vegan friendly, boys and girls.
Well, it depends how you classify yeast, which is actually a really problematic area. Yeast might actually be an animal, but
well, if yeast is an animal, then most of us are bacteria.
Yeah.
People are bacteria.
Well, no, just saying yeast is a really interesting subject and fascinating one, but and essential for turning barley sugars into what we think of as beer. Anyway, this is fine. It's not knocking my socks off.
No, it's dark and it's heavy.
So for beer review,
yeah,
it's fine. It's okay.
It's 370.
Actually, you know what?
375ml bottle can, 5% alcohol, $6 a bottle.
I'm pretty sure they have won very major awards for this beer, and the more I drink on it, because with amber ales, and I would almost call this a red, but yeah, it's in the middle of the amber to red spectrum. It's often that the hops are so freaking heavy that it makes your mouth pucker, and this doesn't, because they've contained themselves and kept it good. So the more I drink of this, the more I actually appreciate it. So if you ever get a chance to try a Prancing Pony Amber Ale, I would say give it a go. It's a really good beer.
I only have one though, because it's a bit too much chewing for me. Yeah, Anyway, So Brandon says, you reckon next time we need an American beer, let him know. All right, we'll try that. We'd love to have good American beers, but we just can't. You can't get them in Canberra or where they are. I don't know.
Rob, beer cartel, Rob, beer cartel. And just Google beer cartel. They'll sort you out. All right. Anyway, Rob's beer purchasing at least it's not a Dutch beer pretending to be a Czech beer. So
it has American right on the label. All right. That was the fallback. The only fallback I could get. But anyway. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I really enjoyed that one. The interim.
Chima River's just opened a cellar door
bar
here in Canberra.
Yeah,
So I have mixed feelings about that, but they're irrelevant. So let's keep going. All right, I think we're done with the podcast, Rob.
I think so.
Yeah, it's been a long-ish one for us. Thank you to everyone for listening. Hopefully, we've got some audio that'll be useful in the podcast. I'm really feeling nervous about this, but okay. On this note, let us say goodbye to everyone. Thank you for listening to us.
And if you want to buy an M60, make sure you get your bids in by 22nd of April to the Spanish military or whatever it is.
Yeah, and invite us to come for a ride.
That would be awesome.
Graham is selling his Stuart as well.
There you go. So good on him.
If you want a beautifully restored Stuart tank, our friend Graham is selling his. Although he does want $250,000, so I say good luck to you, Graham.
That's what they're going for. I mean, having put the work in.
Yeah, and also Stuarts are at least they're a moderate weight that you can actually take it to places and get it on things, and yeah, it makes sense. Anyway, all right folks.
See you next month, and take care all.
Yeah.